I'm going for a gravel ride, and I'm going to ride two different bikes. One fitted with a suspension fork, and one fitted with a suspension stem, so that I can evaluate how these two different methods of smoothing out your gravel riding compare and where the advantages for each system lies, so that you are more informed and up to speed with this kind of tech. Suspension on bikes is nothing new. Mountain bikes have used this kind of technology for absolutely ages, and suspension even made its way onto road bikes for a little while. But gravel bikes, well, it's here that I feel like suspension could have found a new home. Now, both of these different systems I'm using to illustrate this are designed to absorb the bumps and vibrations which are transferred up through the bike to you, the rider, from the surface and terrain that you're riding on, so that in theory, it can make cycling a far more enjoyable experience. Fitted to this bike is the Frequence suspension stem from Vecnam. It takes a different approach to what would be perceived as your traditional suspension setup. It has 30mm of travel, it's machined from 7075 aluminium and uses titanium hardware and fixings. And whilst cycling purists out there might not be a big fan of its design and the looks of it, I think it's a very neat, compact and smart looking thing. It works using a parallelogram design and a set of elastomers inside, which compress as you hit a bump and then return back to their original position. And on the other hand, you have suspension forks, something which many of us will have seen on a large number of bikes before. These ones are the GVX fork from SR Suntour, and they come in a range of 3 different options in terms of the travel. You have 40, 50 and 60mm versions. These ones are the 50s. They're mostly constructed from 7000 series aluminium, and the lowers of the fork are made from magnesium. They're air sprung and use a hydraulic dampener to control the rebound, which is the speed the fork returns at over the bumpy terrain. Now, a fork like this is more complex, but it does have a greater amount of adjustability. In terms of bike compatibility, there's a fair bit to discuss here, so I'll get onto that a little bit later on in the video, because right now I am itching to get back out on these bikes, hit the trails. Aside from the obvious differences of how these two systems fit and look on our bikes, there is one difference which I think most people will not have heard of. So let's discuss that first, and it's sprung and unsprung mass. Now, this is something that the motor industry puts great emphasis on when designing cars and motorbikes, and it relates to what proportion of the overall system weight is either supported above or below the moving suspension element. And if that hasn't really helped you out much, let me show you on the suspension stem bike. So here, the sprung mass is everything above the suspension. So you've got the handlebars, everything attached to the handlebars, and a large proportion of the rider weight. The unsprung mass is quite simply everything else. So on this setup, you have a high proportion of unsprung mass. And then over here on our suspension fork, you have a higher proportion of sprung mass. And that is because you're taking into consideration a greater proportion of the bike and rider weight, because we've also got the contact points on the saddle and the pedals to take into account. Therefore, using our suspension fork, we have a lower proportion of unsprung mass. And it's generally considered the lower the unsprung mass, the better. Now, of course, these two different setups that we're looking at are only really taking into consideration the front wheels of our bikes. Understandably, we should all know we've got 2 wheels. So to account for the whole system, we'd have to have rear suspension as well. Now, if we're looking at how these two setups differ in how they work, when you hit a bump, that movement has got to be transferred all the way up through the fork and through the whole bike to our suspension stem to then be isolated before it reaches you, the rider. Whereas on our suspension fork, it's only got to go through the wheel and through the lower section of the fork before it compresses to isolate that movement, rather than it going the whole way through the bike. Now, that was slightly more complicated to explain than I first thought. Hopefully that's cleared it up. In terms of weight, this is where we see the greatest difference between these two different setups. This is down to the difference in size and complexity between the two systems. The suspension stem weighs 287 grams and the suspension fork weighs 1725 grams. But it's no good just comparing those weights to each other, because what we need to compare them against is the additional weight that it adds to the non-suspension version. So Vecnam say the suspension stem adds around 150 grams additional weight. And then over here on the suspension fork, you're looking at much closer to around 1,000 grams. Now obviously those weights are going to vary depending on the setup that you're running, and it may or may not be that crucial to you. But I feel like the type of rider and the type of terrain that you're going to be riding on and using a suspension stem or fork, that weight isn't really going to be that crucial. So let me tell you some more about the suspension stem. It fits on an 1.1/8" steerer tube. It comes in 3 different stem lengths. You have a 90mm, 105mm and 120mm. Now I've already mentioned that it has 30mm of travel. 20mm of that is negative, so that's the handlebars moving towards the front wheel, and 10mm of that is positive, so the handlebars moving away from the front wheel. And you should look at this the same way as you would with setting up the sag of a suspension fork. And because it's using the parallelogram design, it means as the stem is working, the handlebars are not going to rotate, but they will move forwards ever so slightly. And the sprung element inside the stem can be adjusted to suit rider weights between 50 and 120 kilograms. Whereas over here on the suspension fork, we have additional features and additional adjustability, such as the little lockout lever on the top of the fork, which allows you to limit the movement for when you're riding along smooth tarmac or blasting up a climb. You also have an adjustable air spring, an adjustable rebound, which is allowing you to fine-tune the ride characteristics depending on the rider weight and the rider style. And when it comes to the steerer tube, this one is tapered, so it's 1.5 inches at the bottom and 1.1/8 inches at the top, which is the standard used for most bikes, but not this one. Meaning now seems like a very appropriate time to discuss compatibility. And when it comes to installing a suspension stem on your bike, it really is almost as simple as just swapping out the old one for the suspension version. You have, of course, got to account for the fact of the cables and hoses, and you do need to account to make sure that the bike and the frame has clearance for the movement of the suspension stem. But other than that, it's pretty much fit it and away you go. However, with a suspension fork, you've got far more to think about. You've got to think about hose and cable routing, brake compatibility, and the headset. So this bike traditionally uses 1.5 inches steerer at the bottom and 1.25 inches at the top. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this suspension fork is 1.5 inches and 1.1/8 inches at the top. So this means I've had to purchase an additional shim and some special headset bearings at an additional cost. But it's not a big deal, but it is something to take into consideration. And you also need to account for the fact that by fitting a suspension fork, you're not drastically altering the geometry of the bike. Now this is unlikely to be an issue unless you start trying to fit a mountain bike suspension fork to your gravel bike. In terms of tunability, both suspension units allow you to adjust them relative to the rider weight. The suspension stem, it's typically a mechanical adjustment, and on the suspension fork, typically a pneumatic one, using that air spring. But on the suspension fork, there's another adjustment which you can make, and that's to do with the rebound. So the rebound is simply how quickly the fork can return to its original length once it's been compressed. Now, mountain bike nerds will spend absolutely ages dialing in these settings, so I would say it's an important aspect to consider if you really want to fine-tune the characteristics of your bike. In terms of the riding that I've been doing today, both of these methods of suspension are working as intended and helping with the comfort and control that I have when I'm riding. But what about people whose budget doesn't stretch as far as components like this? Or maybe you just feel this sort of stuff isn't for you. What options have you got? What if I told you about a different type of suspension, one that's already installed on every single type of bike and has hundreds, if not thousands of different options to choose from? The tyres of your bike. Yep, I've said it many times before, but your tyres are a great place to look when upgrading your bike. And as the first point of contact with the ground, when they're compressing, they're acting as a form of suspension. Choose the correct type and the correct pressure to run your tyres at, and you're really going to be able to enhance your cycling experience. Now, once you've got that right, and then you decide you want to take things further still, it's at that point that I feel like you could start looking at your different options, such as suspension forks and suspension stems. So which type of suspension system is right for you? Well, it all depends on the type of riding that you're doing, the surface that you're riding on, the budget that you have to spend, and of course, your level of mechanical skills. The suspension stem is a great choice for riders who want a simple and effective solution with minimal fuss, whereas the suspension fork is great for riders who are going to go on a more demanding and technical terrain and really want more adjustability. But for that, you're going to typically expect to pay in the region of 50 to 70% more for a suspension fork than a suspension stem. Ultimately, both of these methods will help improve the comfort and control that you have on your bike. But you've got to remember, you've also got your tyres and tyre pressures to use too, and perhaps suspension on a gravel bike might not be for you. So choose whatever method suits your needs best, and rest assured that you're going to be able to enjoy the next gravel ride you head out on. Hopefully you enjoyed this video and you found it really informative and helpful. If you have, please like this video and subscribe to our channel to help support what we do. And please do let me know in the comments section down below if you think suspension is right for you. Right, see you later.